Close your eyes for a moment and picture the interior of a modern hospital. What is the immediate sensation that floods your mind? It is likely the blinding, sterile glare of fluorescent lights reflecting off polished linoleum floors. It is the sharp, unmistakable chemical odor of bleach, rubbing alcohol, and synthetic sanitizers masking the scent of sickness. It is the rhythmic, anxiety-inducing beeping of electronic monitors, the hum of climate control systems, and the claustrophobic feeling of being contained within a purely functional, lifeless box. You're in a structure designed with a singular, clinical purpose: to isolate the biological organism, hold it in a static state, and administer chemical compounds until symptoms subside. We have been conditioned to believe that this is the absolute pinnacle of human medical achievement. We are told that anything that came before this was a dark age of ignorance, a time of primitive squalor, dirt floors, and rudimentary, superstitious care. But what if this narrative is not merely incomplete, but entirely inverted? What if the history of medicine is not a straight, upward line of scientific progress, but rather a story of an orchestrated, tragic erasure? To understand the magnitude of what has been hidden from us, we must first look at the physical evidence that they desperately tried, and largely succeeded, to wipe from the face of the earth. We must look at the grand medical monuments of the pre-19th century world. If the official historical narrative is to be believed, that old world medicine was nothing but a chaotic, unhygienic nightmare of bloodletting and miasma theory, then the structures built to house these practices should reflect that primitive misunderstanding. They should be utilitarian, makeshift, and rudimentary. Yet, the photographic and architectural records of the hospitals that existed before 1900s tell a completely different, almost impossible story. Look at the original Hôtel Dieu in Paris, situated on the Île de la Cité. Before its massive reconstruction and the systemic demolition of its ancient wings in the late 19th century, it was not a mere ward. It was a colossal, awe-inspiring cathedral of healing. Look at the ancient, sprawling complex of the Royal Edinburgh Asylum in Scotland, the magnificent domes of the Pennsylvania Hospital, the sprawling, symmetrical wings of the Groote Schuur in Cape Town, or the breathtaking Hospital de Santo Antonio in Porto. These were not primitive shelters for the dying. These were architectural masterpieces of staggering proportion. They featured impossibly high, vaulted stone ceilings, vast geometric courtyards that maximized the flow of natural light and atmospheric currents, and long, perfectly proportioned corridors built from massive, polished masonry. Here lies the first glaring paradox, the undeniable visual dissonance that shatters the official timeline. If these massive structures were merely breeding grounds for infection, why were they designed with the acoustic and geometric precision of grand cathedrals? And more importantly, if they were simply outdated, why were they not repurposed, as so many historical buildings are? Instead, between the years of 1880 and 1910, an inexplicable, coordinated phenomenon occurred across the globe. In the span of a single generation, almost every major, monumental hospital of the Old World was systematically targeted for demolition. From the heart of Europe to the coasts of the Americas, down to the southern tip of Africa, the wrecking balls swung in terrifying unison. These magnificent stone monoliths were reduced to rubble, completely wiped from the urban landscape, and rapidly replaced by the cramped, utilitarian, uninspiring brick and concrete wards of the early 20th century. We are told this was simply the triumph of the new germ theory, a necessary clearing of old, infected masonry. But the scale, the speed, and the sheer totality of this global destruction suggest something much darker. It suggests not a renovation, but an eradication. They were not simply destroying buildings, they were destroying a technology. To grasp what was truly lost under the crushing weight of those wrecking balls, we must fundamentally change how we understand the concept of a hospital. Today, a hospital is merely a container. It is a sterile shell designed to house the patient while doctors act as mechanics, delivering pharmaceutical products into the biological machine. The building itself does nothing to heal you. It is merely a protective envelope. But the towering, vaulted hospitals of the old world operated on a philosophy that is almost alien to our modern, chemically dependent minds. These ancient complexes were not containers. They were active, living machines. They were environmental mechanisms of healing. Every archway, every stone column, every precisely calculated window placement was designed to interact with the human body. They manipulated light. They guided the flow of pure air. But above all, they were built for resonance. This brings us to the great hidden secret of these destroyed architectural marvels, a secret that has been carefully scrubbed from the annals of modern medical history. Tucked away in the soaring towers and embedded deeply within the geometric centers of the medical wings were colossal, multi-ton bronze bells. The conventional historians and the tour guides of today will quickly dismiss these bells, telling you they were merely religious artifacts, placed there to call the staff to prayer or to toll for the passing of a soul. They tell us these bells belonged strictly in the domain of the hospital chapel, but a careful forensic examination of surviving blueprints and forgotten architectural sketches reveals a stunningly different reality. These massive acoustic instruments were not isolated in chapels. They were strategically integrated directly into the recovery wards. They were positioned in the very heart of the healing wings, suspended in perfectly engineered resonant chambers that connected to the vaulted ceilings of the patient corridors. Why would you place an earth-shattering instrument of bronze directly above the beds of the sick and the dying? The answer lies buried in the forgotten archives of a medical science that was deliberately murdered. Let us look at the forensic evidence. Deep in the basement archives of a Scottish library, there exists a fragile, leather-bound diary written in 1847 by a senior administrator of the Royal Edinburgh Asylum. Within its fading, handwritten pages, there is no mention of calling people to prayer. Instead, the administrator meticulously records the use of the great hospital bells as a primary medical treatment. He details specific, mathematical patterns of tolling the bells for patients suffering from severe chronic pain, debilitating melancholia, and severe nervous disorders. The diary records, with clinical detachment, that these sustained acoustic treatments produced states of deep physical calm and accelerated recoveries that the rudimentary chemical compounds of the era could not even begin to approach. The sound was not an accompaniment to the medicine. The sound was the medicine. This was not an isolated Scottish eccentricity. As we dig deeper into the suppressed records, a global pattern of acoustic therapy emerges. In the meticulous medical archives of Vienna in 1863, we find detailed treatises on tonal therapies, where specific frequencies were used to stabilize the heart rates of patients in crisis. If we travel across the world to the humid, bustling port of Macau in 1904, records from a Portuguese colonial hospital describe the use of massive, precisely cast resonant brass vessels. These vessels were struck repeatedly in the wards of patients suffering from severe tropical fevers, with the resulting vibrations reportedly breaking the fevers and inducing necessary restorative sleep. And in the dusty archives of New Orleans, an 1887 memoir of a recovering patient describes the daily physical sensation of the hospital bells. She wrote not of a sound she heard, but of a heavy, comforting vibration that moved through the stone floor, up through the iron legs of her bed, and settled deep into her chest, easing her shattered nerves and drawing the pain from her bones. Modern science, in its supreme arrogance, dismissed these accounts as the quaint imaginations of a primitive era. Yet, today, the most cutting-edge, experimental branches of modern physics and biology are quietly rediscovering exactly what the architects of those demolished hospitals already knew. When you strike a massive, meticulously cast bronze bell inside a vaulted stone corridor, you do not just create a loud noise. You generate a powerful, sustained field of low-frequency harmonic resonance. The grand bells of the old world were engineered to operate precisely within the acoustic range of 40 to 200 Hz. Pause and consider that specific frequency range, 40 to 200 Hz. If you read the latest, peer-reviewed studies on experimental vibroacoustic therapy today, you will find that this exact spectrum of low-frequency sound is being hailed as a miraculous frontier in medicine. Modern researchers have discovered that exposing the human body to frequencies between 40 and 200 Hz actively stimulates cellular repair. It increases bone density, accelerates the healing of torn tissues, dramatically reduces the markers of systemic inflammation, and profoundly calms the central nervous system by altering brainwave states. The human body is, fundamentally, a dense acoustic vessel, mostly composed of water. When subjected to the deep, resonant waves of a massive bronze bell, the body does not just hear the sound, it physically absorbs it. The ancient hospitals were constructed as colossal acoustic amplifiers, designed to bathe the sick in a continuous, healing wash of cellular repairing frequencies. It was an advanced, harmonious, and entirely non-invasive technology of life. So, if this technology was so profoundly effective, so deeply integrated into the greatest architectural structures of the time, what happened to it? Why did the wrecking balls come? The destruction of the acoustic hospital was not an accident of progress. It was the execution of a perfect, cold-blooded economic crime. It was the largest and most successful hostile takeover in the history of human health. The turning point, the definitive moment the knife was twisted into the back of natural healing, occurred in the United States in the year 1910, though its shockwaves instantly dictated global policy. This was the year the infamous Flexner Report was published. The report was heavily funded and directed by the titans of the emerging petrochemical and industrial monopolies, men of unimaginable wealth who had recently discovered how to synthesize coal tar and oil derivatives into patentable, profitable chemical compounds. The Flexner Report audited every medical school in the country and systematically declared that any institution teaching natural, botanical, electrical, or resonance-based therapies was unscientific quackery. The motive was brutally simple and entirely economic. You cannot patent a building. You cannot place a copyright on a frequency. You cannot put a price tag on the resonant vibration of a bronze bell interacting with the geometry of a stone archway. A hospital that heals through its environment is a hospital that provides a perpetual, infinite, and essentially free source of therapy. For the emerging pharmaceutical empires, this was not just competition. It was an existential threat. They required a paradigm shift. They needed the human body to be viewed not as a resonant organism requiring harmonic balance, but as a biochemical machine requiring constant, measurable, and above all, purchasable chemical inputs. The Flexner Report ensured that hundreds of medical schools were forcibly closed. The knowledge of acoustic architecture was violently excised from the curriculum. The definition of a hospital was rewritten by law, transitioning from a sanctuary of resonant healing to a strictly controlled mechanism for chemical distribution. The sheer, bizarre irony of this transition is staggering when you look at what this new, supposedly enlightened medical establishment offered in place of the bells. While they were busy demolishing magnificent vaulted acoustic chambers and labeling sound healing as primitive superstition, The modern pharmaceutical industry was legally and aggressively pushing actual poisons onto the public. While the wrecking balls smashed the old hospitals, the great scientifically approved companies like Bayer were heavily marketing and prescribing heroin as a non-addictive cough syrup, perfectly safe for infants and children. Doctors of this new, enlightened era were prescribing massive doses of cocaine for lethargy. They were selling radioactive water, tonics laced with radium, promising glowing health and vitality, while their patients' jaws literally rotted and fell from their skulls. They labeled the harmonious, cellular repairing vibration of a bronze bell as a dangerous relic of the past, while proudly selling radioactive poison and highly addictive narcotics as the glittering future of modern science. They traded the harmless, resonant architecture of healing for a wildly lucrative empire of patented chemical toxins. But the final, most tragic act of this historical erasure involves the fate of the instruments themselves. What happened to the thousands of giant, mathematically perfect healing bells that once hung in the medical wards of Paris, London, Edinburgh, and beyond? When the old hospitals were targeted for demolition, the bells were not preserved in museums. They hit a wall of absolute bureaucratic silence. Records show they were quietly and systematically confiscated. And then, history provided the perfect, unassailable excuse to make them disappear forever: the World Wars. Under the grand, patriotic disguise of the war effort, governments across the globe initiated massive scrap metal drives. The official narrative claims that all available bronze and brass was desperately needed for the survival of the nations, but the speed and precision with which the old hospital bells were targeted speak to a different agenda. The heavy, resonant instruments of the old world were pulled from their towers, dragged through the dirt, and thrown into the roaring industrial furnaces. They were melted down in a frenzy of destruction. Stop and deeply internalize the horrific poetry of that moment. The very instruments engineered to vibrate at the exact frequency of cellular repair, the massive bronze artifacts designed to soothe the dying and heal the broken, were melted down to be cast into artillery shells, mortar casings, and bullets. The technology of life was literally forged into the technology of mass death. The healing frequencies of the old world were silenced so that the deafening, destructive roar of modern warfare could take their place. This staggering loss forces us to step back and look at the broader, even more unsettling mystery that surrounds these events. When you examine the timeline and the geography of these demolitions, a logistical impossibility begins to emerge. How did the city planners, medical boards, and governments of Paris, London, New York, Buenos Aires, Sydney, and Bombay all simultaneously decide to abandon their colossal medical architecture and adopt the exact same standardized pharmaceutical model? How did they coordinate the destruction of these buildings and the rewriting of medical curriculum across the entire globe between 1880 and 1910, an era long before instant digital communication, globalist health organizations, or even reliable transoceanic phone lines? The absolute uniformity of this planetary shift does not look like natural cultural evolution. It reeks of a managed, highly coordinated global erasure. This brings us to the most profound architectural anomaly of all, a mystery that points to a completely different version of human history. When forensic researchers attempt to find the original construction documents for these massive, demolished Old World hospitals, they frequently encounter an impossible void. We have millions of pages of operational records from the 1800s, patient intake forms, invoices for bandages, coal receipts, payrolls for nurses. We know exactly how these buildings were managed, but when you look for the blueprints, the architectural drafts, or the financial ledgers detailing the initial construction of these colossal stone monuments, the archives are overwhelmingly, deafeningly empty. How does a society construct a building the size of the Hôtel Dieu or the Royal Edinburgh Asylum without leaving behind mountains of architectural drafts and construction ledgers? The chilling, unavoidable conclusion that many independent researchers are now reaching is that the people operating these hospitals in the 19th century did not build them. They inherited them. These sprawling, mathematically perfect machines of acoustic healing were the remnants of a prior, highly advanced civilization, a global culture often referred to in alternative historical circles as Tartaria, or simply the Old World. This was a civilization that possessed a profound, lost understanding of the intricate physical relationship between sacred geometry, colossal architecture, resonant frequencies, and human biology. The people of the 1800s were merely utilizing the leftover infrastructure of a society that had already mastered the art of living in harmony with the natural physics of the earth. The rapid demolition of these hospitals was not just about ushering in the age of the pill. It was a vital step in erasing the physical proof that this advanced predecessor civilization ever existed. The masters of the new industrial age could not allow the masses to live amidst towering, functional reminders that a better, freer, and more harmonious way of life was possible. The old hospitals stood as monolithic threats to the new narrative of constant, linear human progress. They had to be destroyed because their very existence proved that the modern world was not advancing, but regressing into a state of chemical subjugation. As we stand today, breathing the sterile, artificially conditioned air of our modern medical complexes, we must deeply reflect on what was taken from us. The modern medical system, for all its dazzling surgical interventions and emergency trauma care, has fundamentally disconnected us from the healing power of our own environment. It has isolated us from the natural frequencies of the earth and locked us into a lifelong, inescapable subscription to synthetic compounds. The hospital is no longer a place you go to be healed by the resonance of the space. It is a pharmaceutical dispensary where your biological symptoms are managed for maximum economic yield. The grand stone arches have been pulverized into dust. The beautiful, mathematically precise geometry of the old wards has been replaced by the oppressive, right-angled grid of the modern clinical corridor. And the bells, those massive, majestic instruments that once sang the frequencies of cellular repair into the chests of the suffering, have long since been vaporized in the fires of war and industry. We are left to wonder, as we navigate this heavily medicated, chronically ill modern world, what else was thrown into those furnaces? When the architects of our current reality decided to erase the acoustic healing of the past, what other profound natural truths did they melt away from our collective memory? The silence left behind by those destroyed bells is deafening, and it is a silence we have been paying for with our health, our history, and our freedom every single day since.